Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're wandering into the softer shadows of the Middle Ages. You might want to grab some tea, dim the lights, and maybe tuck yourself in. Because the people we're talking about tonight, well, let's just say they weren't exactly winning any medieval most huggable contests. Now, when people think of the Middle Ages, they usually picture knights in armor, princesses in towers, and peasants trying very hard not to die from, well, everything. But the darker corners of that world were populated by some individuals who really leaned into the whole life is nasty, brutish, and short thing. And while most people at the time were busy trying to avoid plagues, starvation, or angry overlords, a few rare souls had the free time, the wealth, and apparently the boredom to spend their days perfecting the fine art of being terrible. Yes, tonight we're looking at medieval serial killers. The aristocratic kind, the knightly kind, and the ones who managed to leave their mark not just on history, but also on an impressive number of unfortunate victims. Don't worry though, we'll float through it gently. No gore, no edge-of-your-seat suspense. Just calmly walking through some of history's weirdest, darkest, and most misguided hobbies. So, let's ease into this strange gallery of figures, starting with someone who basically redefined creepy nobleman with too much time on his hands, Gilles de Rais. The Bluebeard of France, our first medieval nightmare in noble clothing, is Gilles de Rais, born around 1405 in Brittany, France. Now, Gilles wasn't just some random highway bandit. No, he was a knight, a baron, and a man who fought alongside none other than Joan of Arc. Yes, the sainted teenage warrior girl of France had this guy riding in her company, which feels a little like finding out your yoga instructor also moonlights as a taxidermist for our Oddities. Gilles was rich. And not just comfortable chateau and a nice tapestry rich, he was cartoonishly wealthy. At one point, he owned about 25 castles, which is more castles than most kings could realistically keep track of. But like many medieval nobles, he also had the spending habits of a spoiled child who just discovered credit cards. His favorite pastime? Stage productions. And when I say stage productions, I don't mean, a few actors on a wooden platform. Gilles would spend today's equivalent of millions of dollars on massive, elaborate plays. He once had over 100 performers and gave out free food and wine to the entire audience. Because clearly the path to glory was amateur theater. Now, you might think, okay, so he's eccentric, he's a little dramatic, but maybe he's just a weird theater kid with money, and sure, that would have been fine. But Gilles had other hobbies once his fortune began to dwindle, and it did, because shockingly, throwing Broadway-level productions in rural Brittany isn't financially sustainable. He turned to darker interests. And by darker, I mean he allegedly murdered a truly appalling number of children. The record suggests dozens. Some say hundreds. Historians debate the exact number, but either way, it was enough to earn him the nickname Bluebeard. Now, here's the important thing. The Middle Ages were not exactly a time known for meticulous police work. So the details of Gilles' crimes are wrapped in legend, court testimony, and probably a healthy dose of exaggeration. Some scholars argue he may have been the victim of a politically convenient trial. Others are convinced the sheer scale of accusations couldn't have been fabricated. What we do know is that in 1440 he was arrested, tried, and confessed under what we might politely call very enthusiastic questioning. And then, like so many disgraced nobles before him, he was executed. The irony. Gilles de Rais had been a celebrated war hero, a companion to Joan of Arc, and one of France's wealthiest men. He could have lived out his days in velvet slippers, sipping wine by a fire. Instead, he left behind a legacy as one of the first documented serial killers in European history. Let's drift away from France now, and float gently northwards, to Scotland, where we find another cheerful medieval tale, this one involving caves, cannibalism, and way too many family dinners. Sawney Bean, Scotland's cannibal clan leader now. I should warn you, Sawney Bean is one of those figures who sits in the foggy middle ground between legend and history. Did he exist? Maybe, did he do the things people said he did? Probably not all of them. But the story became so popular that it took on a life of its own, and for centuries, People swore up and down that he was real Dotso. Who was he supposed to be? According to legend, Alexander Sawney Bean was a man born in the late Middle Ages in East Lothian, Scotland. He wasn't keen on honest work. Apparently ditch digging was beneath him. Instead, he took a wife, moved into a cave near the coast, and decided to support himself in the time-honored serial killer way, ambushing travelers, except Sawney didn't just rob them. He and his wife, and eventually their disturbingly large brood of children and grandchildren, turned to cannibalism. Yes, the whole family business model was basically murder, eat, repeat. Over the course of about 25 years, the Bean clan supposedly killed and ate more than 1,000 people. Which is ambitious, to say the least. Their lair? A deep-sea cave with multiple tunnels that stretched nearly a mile. At high tide, the entrance was hidden by water, which makes it sound less like a real Scottish cave and more like something out of a Scooby-Doo episode. Inside, they apparently stored body parts like leftovers, preserved with salt, or hung up like a grotesque butcher shop. And yes, people believed this story for generations. Eventually, according to the legend, the Bean family got a little too bold. They attacked a couple returning from a fair, but the man fought them off long enough for soldiers to get involved. King James VI of Scotland supposedly led a manhunt, discovered the cave, and captured the entire murderous clan. Their punishment was predictably medieval, execution by dismemberment with no trial necessary. Because due process didn't always make the guest list in the 16th century. Now, most historians today agree that Sawney Bean probably never existed, at least not in the form described. The story might have been a piece of English propaganda, designed to paint the Scots as barbaric cannibals. Or it could simply have been a fireside legend that grew with each retelling. But whether true or not, the myth of Sawney Bean became one of the most famous serial killer stories of the medieval era. And honestly, real or not, he still makes the list. Because when your family's claim to fame is medieval, cave-dwelling cannibal dynasty, you've earned a place in the Dark Folklore Hall of Fame. Let's drift a little further now, to Hungary, where we meet a noblewoman whose reputation has earned her the charming title of the Blood Countess, because subtlety was never the strong suit of medieval nicknames. Elizabeth Báthory. The Blood Countess Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful Protestant families in Hungary. She was rich, titled, and connected to basically every important noble family in Eastern Europe. In other words, she could have just coasted on privilege. But apparently, that wasn't exciting enough. She married at 15 because nothing says romance like teenage. Arranged marriages, and moved into a massive castle with her new husband, Count Ferenc Nadasdy. He was known as the Black Knight of Hungary, which sounds like a comic book villain, but in reality just meant he enjoyed torturing Ottoman prisoners of war. A match made in sadist heaven, apparently. Now, while her husband was off at war, Elizabeth allegedly kept herself busy by experimenting on the servants. The stories claim she abused, tortured, and eventually killed anywhere from 80 to several hundred young girls. The most famous legend, of course, is that she bathed in their blood to preserve her youthful beauty, which sounds dramatic, but also like the kind of rumor your rivals would absolutely spread about you if you were an unpopular noblewoman in the 1600s. The truth is murkier. Yes, she was arrested in 1610, after complaints from local clergy and nobility about the suspicious number of dead servant girls around her estates. Yes, witnesses testified to horrible acts, but the trial was politically convenient. Elizabeth owned vast lands, and stripping her of power benefited her enemies. So, was she really a blood-bathing serial killer or just a very disliked woman accused of being one? Historians are still divided. What we know for sure is that she was never executed. Instead, she was bricked up inside a room of her own castle with only small holes left for food and air. She remained there for 4 years until her death in 1614, which is a very medieval way of saying, "We don't want to kill you, but we also don't want to see you anymore." Elizabeth's legend grew over the centuries, inspiring everything from Gothic novels to horror films. She's sometimes even linked to the vampire myths of Eastern Europe. Whether she really murdered hundreds or just got caught in the crossfire of politics, She's remembered as one of the most notorious figures of the late medieval early modern world. And that feels like a good place to pause for tonight's first drift through medieval nightmares. We've met a French knight who swapped war for alleged child murder, a Scottish cave clan who might have been propaganda with a taste for long pig, and a Hungarian countess who may or may not have had a thing for skincare routines that were a little too crimson. So where were we? Yes. We've already wandered past France, Scotland, and Hungary. We've seen nobles who apparently didn't understand the concept of hobbies, and aristocrats who turned too much free time into international reputation as monsters. Now, let's float gently into the German-speaking world. Because believe it or not, Germany in the late Middle Ages and early modern period was a goldmine of serial killer legends. And tonight, we'll meet two of the strangest, Peter Niers and Christman Genipperteinga. Both men were so notorious that their names became almost like boogeyman stories for centuries afterward. The kind of bedtime tales you tell children if you want them to grow up with deep trust issues and possibly night sweats. Peter Niers, the sorcerer butcher first up. Peter Niers was active in the late 1500s, which technically edges us just past the high medieval period. But don't worry, the vibes are still very medieval. He was a wandering bandit, robber, and if contemporary pamphlets are to be believed, part-time sorcerer with a fondness for unborn children. Yes, this story is about to get very, very medieval. According to reports, Niers began his career as a humble thief. But then he graduated to murder with a flair for the dramatic. Rumors claimed he was part of a massive criminal gang of 24 men who roamed the countryside robbing and killing travelers. That alone would be enough for a grim legend. But, of course, the 16th century tabloids couldn't resist adding some flair. Niers, they said, practiced black magic. He supposedly carried around the fetuses of murdered women in little jars, using them to fuel spells of invisibility and shape-shifting. Yes, apparently Harry Potter missed that chapter. Some claimed he could turn himself into animals at will: a goat, a dog, or even a cat. Which, if true, would make him the least snuggly cat in Europe. So, how many murders did he commit? The pamphlets claim anywhere between 500 and 544 people. Which is, let's be honest, a suspiciously specific number for an era without spreadsheets. The figure is almost certainly exaggerated, but it shows how terrified people were of him. Eventually, his luck ran out. In 1581, Niers stopped at an inn while traveling through Germany. The innkeeper noticed he was carrying suspiciously bulky packages. When Niers went out, probably to run errands or shapeshift into a donkey, the innkeeper peeked inside and found body parts, which is really not the kind of thing you want to stumble across while changing the bedsheets. Niers was arrested, tortured, and executed in the usual three-part German style. First, he was broken on the wheel on 2 separate occasions, then burned alive. Because the Holy Roman Empire liked to make sure punishments were as thorough as possible, the story of Peter Niers spread through countless pamphlets and broadsheets, becoming one of the most famous serial killer tales of the early modern world. Was he really a mass murderer with jars of fetus magic? Probably not. Was he a killer? Almost certainly. Either way, the legend ensured that Niers went down in history as the literal boogeyman of Central Europe, Christman Genipperteinga, the German caveman if you thought. Niers was over the top. Allow me to introduce Christman Genipperteinga, another German bandit whose story is equal parts terrifying and suspiciously exaggerated. Christman supposedly lived in the 1500s, and like Niers, his story comes down to us mainly through pamphlets. According to them, he had a secret hideout in a cave somewhere in Germany, where he lived with a gang of followers and his unfortunate girlfriend. From this cozy underground residence, he launched a 13-year campaign of robbery and murder. The victim count? Brace yourself, 964 people. Yes, the pamphlets claimed he killed nearly 1,000 victims, which if you do the math, works out to about 1 murder every 5 days for over a decade. Ambitious. Exhausting, really. At some point, you'd expect him to take a vacation. Like Sawney Bean, Christman supposedly stored body parts in his cave, along with treasure taken from travelers. He was eventually captured when his girlfriend escaped and told authorities where to find him. Because apparently, if you want to run a successful long-term criminal operation, step one is, don't mistreat your girlfriend when captured. Christman was executed in the classic German way, broken on the wheel over the course of 9 days. Yes, 9 days. Which feels like too much commitment for anyone, honestly. Now, modern historians agree that the details of Christman's story are highly dubious. It may have been moral propaganda, or an exaggerated retelling of a real bandit. But the legend stuck. And for centuries afterward, Christman Genipperteinga was remembered as one of the most prolific killers of all time. Medieval banditry and the serial killer overlap at this point. You might be noticing a theme. Many of these so-called serial killers were also bandits. And that makes sense in a time when law enforcement was, let's call it optional. Traveling the countryside was dangerous. Bandits often murdered travelers for money, food, or just because they could. The line between robber and serial killer was blurry, but pamphlets and folklore loved to inflate these figures into something bigger: monsters, sorcerers, and cannibals. It made for good reading, and it reinforced moral lessons. Don't stray off the road. Don't trust strangers. Don't harbor bandits in your tavern unless you're ready to deal with jars of suspickled fetuses. Moving on nightly. Sadist spore, we wrap this part. Let's gently float to another type of killer. Not the bandit lurking in the forest, but the knight or nobleman who turned cruelty into a lifestyle. In medieval chronicles, you sometimes come across figures who were technically warriors, but whose methods of justice strayed into serial killer territory. Men who delighted in torture, who executed peasants for fun, or who had reputations so cruel that even other nobles took notice. One example was Ingérend de Marigny, a French minister in the early 1300s, who was accused after his death of torturing prisoners for amusement. Another was Isolino da Romano, an Italian warlord of the 13th century, whose hobby was mass executions. He once allegedly burned 11,000 prisoners alive. That number is almost certainly inflated, but you get the idea. Were they serial killers in the modern sense? Maybe not. But when cruelty becomes personal, habitual, and repeated outside of the battlefield, the line starts to blur. And medieval Europe had plenty of blurred lines, and that feels like another calm stopping point. We've walked through the German forests with Peter Niers and his jars of questionable magic, sat in a cave with Christman and his ridiculous body count, and peeked briefly at some nobles who treated cruelty like a lifestyle choice. In part 3, we'll keep drifting deeper into the odd and unsettling world of medieval killers, maybe swaying over to Italy. Look at a few wandering werewolf cases, and meet some women who got in on the act too. Because medieval serial killing was, unfortunately, an equal opportunity career path. So far, we've tiptoed through France, Scotland, Hungary, and Germany. We've seen nobles with too much free time, bandits with suspiciously inflated victim counts, and at least one man who allegedly carried around jars of, let's just say, problematic baby supplies. Now let's float a little further south into Italy. Because the Italians of the Middle Ages didn't just invent banking, double-entry bookkeeping, and appara. They also gave us some of the earliest stories of werewolf serial killers. And because Europe was never short of paranoid neighbors, accusations of witchcraft and poison soon followed. The werewolf of Gubbio, Pietro Barbi, aka Pietro the Cannibal. Let's start in Umbria, Italy. Around the year 1400, in the town of Gubbio, people began whispering about a man named Pietro Barbi. Now, Pietro was not your friendly village baker. He had a reputation for being violent, unpleasant, and fond of lurking in the woods. Which is basically the medieval trifecta for this guy is definitely bad news, according to reports. Pietro attacked travelers and peasants, killing and sometimes eating them, which is never a great way to make friends. Locals said he would transform into a wolf at night, which is where the whole werewolf label came in. It's worth remembering that in medieval Italy, wolves were terrifyingly real, and attacks weren't uncommon. So if a violent man lived near the forest and bodies started turning up, well, clearly he was a werewolf. Eventually Pietro was captured. His trial records say he confessed to murdering and eating several children. Again, confessions at the time were usually encouraged with generous doses of torture, so take that with a pinch of medieval salt. But the legend stuck. Pietro the Cannibal, the Werewolf of Gubbio, one of Italy's first serial killers. The punishment? Classic werewolf justice, execution by fire. Because in medieval Europe, if someone was even rumored to be part Wolf, fire was the cure-all. The case of Gilles Garnier, the werewolf of Dolcens, were on the werewolf theme. Let's float over to France again for a moment. Around 1573, in the Franche-Comté region, villagers started reporting attacks on children. The culprit, they said, wasn't just a man. It was a werewolf. The accused was Gilles Garnier, a reclusive hermit who lived on the outskirts of town with his wife. He wasn't exactly a social butterfly, and apparently had trouble providing food for his new family. According to the court records, Garnier killed at least 4 children, sometimes eating parts of them, and allegedly using the flesh to feed his wife, when caught. Garnier confessed, not surprisingly, after some enthusiastic medieval interrogation techniques. He supposedly claimed a spectral figure had given him an ointment that allowed him to transform into a wolf, which sounds less like evidence and more like someone mixing fairy tales with desperation. He was burned at the stake in 1574, and his story became a cautionary tale repeated across Europe. Was he truly a serial killer or just an unlucky hermit scapegoated during a time of paranoia? Hard to say. But he earned himself the nickname Werewolf of Dole, which is not the kind of personal brand most people want to be remembered. For medieval poisoners, the quiet killer's not. Every medieval serial killer went for caves, axes, or wolf transformations. Some preferred a subtler approach. Poison. Now, poison was basically the Swiss Army knife of murder in the Middle Ages. It was quiet. It didn't leave a mess, and if you were subtle enough, you could pass it off as mysterious illness. The tricky part, of course, was not poisoning yourself in the process. Medieval recipes for toxins often included delightful ingredients like arsenic, belladonna, and ground-up toads. Because nothing says bon appetit like amphibian seasoning, one of the most infamous poisoners of the era was Giulia Tofana, an Italian woman who lived in the 1600s, technically early modern, but her style was pure medieval subtlety. She created something called aqua tofana, a clear, tasteless poison disguised as holy water or cosmetic oil. It was marketed mainly to women trapped in unhappy marriages. A few drops in the husband's soup, and suddenly you were a widow with new financial freedom. Over the years, Giulia's concoction allegedly helped eliminate hundreds of men. She ran the operation like a family business, passing down the recipe to her daughter. Eventually, word got out, and she was arrested and executed. But the legend of Aqua Tofana lived on, whispered about for generations, and she wasn't alone. Across Europe, poisoning rings often cropped up, sometimes run by apothecaries, sometimes by midwives, sometimes by noblewomen who were just really tired of their husbands. It was the quieter, less flashy cousin of the axe murder, and while it doesn't come with tales of caves and werewolves, it was probably much more common. Noble poison enthusiasts, the Medici and beyond. Speaking of nobles, let's take a calming little stroll to Florence. The Medici family, yes, the banking dynasty that basically invented Renaissance patronage, were often accused of dabbling in poison. Did they actually? Hard to say. The problem with being rich and powerful in the Middle Ages is that everyone assumes you're plotting something, but there are plenty of rumors. Catherine de' Medici, who later became Queen of France, was accused by her enemies of poisoning rivals with her flying squadron of ladies-in-waiting. Conveniently, Catherine was also blamed for nearly everything bad that happened in 16th century France, so the poison accusations might just have been part of the smear campaign. Still, it tells you something that when people in the Renaissance wanted to imagine a secret killer, they immediately pictured Italian nobles with apothecary bottles, shifting back the equal opportunity. Nature of medieval murder. One thing that stands out about these stories is how broad the spectrum of medieval killing really was. Some killers were nobles with too much money and way too many dungeons. Some were wandering hermits accused of being wolves. Some were frustrated women with access to a very handy vial of poison. And while modern definitions of serial killer are precise, requiring a psychological pattern, a cooling-off period, and multiple victims, the medieval world wasn't exactly running on FBI profiling standards. Back then, if you killed more than a couple of people, people either called you a bandit, a werewolf, a witch, or all of the above. Sometimes the truth is impossible to separate from the legends. Let's pause here for a moment. In tonight's drift, we've walked through Italian werewolves, French hermits with questionable diets, and poisoners who turned murder into a small business. Each one adds another strange little corner to the medieval hall of infamy. In Part 4, we'll wander further east into Eastern Europe and Russia. We'll meet some cheerful figures like even the Terrible's less famous imitators, and a few Slavic nobles who put the Gothic in Eastern Gothic folklore. So far we've lingered in France, Germany, Italy, and a little Scotland. But if you drift eastward across the forests and frozen plains, you'll find no shortage of dark legends and noble sadists. Eastern Europe has a reputation for its vampire myths, its werewolves, and its delightfully brooding folklore. But sprinkled in among the folktales were some very real killers, who made enough of an impression that people are still whispering about them centuries later. Daria Saltykova, Russia's noble sadist. Let's start in Russia with one of the most infamous aristocrats you've probably never heard of, Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova. Born in 1730, she's technically a little later than our medieval sweet spot, but her lifestyle was so deeply feudal and old-world cruel that she fits right in. Daria was a wealthy noblewoman with an estate full of serfs. Now, in theory, being a noblewoman meant managing the household, overseeing the peasants, and attending church on Sundays. In practice, Daria turned her estate into her own personal torture chamber. Over the years, she allegedly tortured and killed more than 100 of her female serfs, often beating them to death for trivial offenses like not cleaning fast enough or dropping laundry. Imagine being executed because your folding technique wasn't crisp enough. Not exactly Downton Abbey vibes. What makes her especially notorious is the sheer pettiness of her cruelty. She wasn't eliminating rivals, she wasn't making political moves. She was just angry and apparently found murder to be her preferred form of stress relief. Eventually, even the Russian state couldn't ignore her body count. Villagers began sending complaints directly to Moscow. And since Catherine the Great was on the throne, a ruler who was already pretty invested in cleaning up Russia's reputation, this wasn't something to sweep under the rug. Daria was arrested, put on trial, and convicted. And because she was noble, they didn't execute her. Instead, she was publicly shamed in Red Square, chained up with a sign around her neck that read, "This woman has tortured and murdered." Then she was sent off to spend the rest of her life in a convent prison cell, which, to be fair, is a pretty cozy ending for someone who murdered 100 people with a hairbrush and a bad attitude, even the Terrible. And his Minimi Snow? We can't talk about Russian nightmares without glancing at Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Strictly speaking, he wasn't a serial killer. He was more of a state-sponsored mass murderer. But his personal habits blur the line enough to give him an honorary spot. Even had a temper problem, to put it gently. He's most famous for beating his pregnant daughter-in-law so severely that she miscarried, and then striking his own son in the head with a staff, killing him, which is about as far from the Hallmark Christmas card version of family life as you can get. But what's fascinating is that even inspired smaller-scale imitators. The chronicles mention several lower nobles and boyars who styled themselves as little Ivans, carrying out their own miniature reigns of terror on their estates, like fanboys who looked at a murderous Tsar and thought, yeah, I could do that. But on a local level, unfortunately, the records blur into folklore, so we don't always have names. But the general theme is clear, even made cruelty fashionable among a certain type of ambitious landowner. And when cruelty becomes trendy, you end up with a countryside full of what we might today call serial killers, except with the legal cover of noble. Status. Polish oddities. The case of Countess. Barbara's Dunklets drift west into Poland for a moment. One of the last women ever executed for witchcraft in Europe was Barbara's Dunk, burned at the stake in 1811, again late for our medieval time frame, but her reputation belonged to the same shadowy lineage of medieval monstrous women. Barbara was accused of setting fire to a town in Prussia, killing 4 people. But in the popular imagination, her crimes went further. Rumors swirled that she had killed children, practiced black magic, and generally lived the kind of life guaranteed to end in a pyre. Historians today suspect she was more scapegoat than killer, but her trial shows how, well into the modern era, medieval patterns of accusation lingered. If someone was cruel, violent, or just inconvenient, people assumed they must also be a witch, a poisoner, or worse, Vlad the Impaler, serial killer, or just national defense. And of course, we can't float through Eastern Europe without brushing up against the shadow of Vlad III of Wallachia, also known as Vlad the Impaler. Vlad's reputation is famous. He killed thousands by impalement, earning a reputation so terrifying that centuries later, Bram Stoker decided to turn him into a vampire. But here's the thing, was he really a serial killer, or just a particularly creative military commander? On one hand, most of Vlad's victims were killed in war or as punishment for rebellion. On the other hand, Vlad had a personal streak of sadism. The chronicles describe him enjoying dinner while watching forests of impaled bodies sway in the breeze, which isn't exactly the behavior of a balanced dinner host. The Ottoman envoys once visited him without removing their turbans as a sign of respect for their customs. Vlad responded by nailing the turbans to their heads, which is one way to enforce a dress code. So, Vlad isn't a serial killer in the modern sense, but the tone of his cruelty, personal, inventive, repeated, and ritualized, lands him in the same eerie category. He was both a warlord and a killer who clearly enjoyed the aesthetics of death a little too much, the blurry lines of Eastern cruelty. What stands out about these Eastern figures is the blur between political violence, noble cruelty, and serial killing. Unlike a bandit hiding in a German cave, nobles like Daria Saltykova or Vlad had legal power. Their murders were hidden under the guise of punishment, discipline, or war, but peel back the excuses, and what you find is the same repetitive, obsessive pattern of cruelty we've seen elsewhere. Whether it's a Russian noblewoman beating maids to death for folding badly, or a Wallachian prince turning impalement into a personal brand. The psychology is eerily similar. Let's pause here for a gentle breath. Tonight we've drifted across Russia, Poland, and Wallachia. We've met a noblewoman who turned her serfs into stress toys, a Tsar who accidentally murdered his own son and made cruelty fashionable, and a count who turned national defense into performance art. Asterisk. We've spent some time in Eastern Europe with Vlad and his scenic forests of impaled bodies, so let's gently float back toward the more familiar castles of England and France. You'd think life in these polished courts would be all banquets, jousts, and bad lute music. But as it turns out, a surprising number of nobles also dabbled in what we'd politely call extracurricular cruelty. King John of England. Cruelty as a hobby. Let's start with King John of England. Yes, that John, the one who lost Normandy, annoyed his barons and was eventually forced to sign Magna Carta. History books already paint him as one of England's worst kings, and honestly, he earned it. John had the charisma of a wet sponge and the people skills of a cranky raccoon. He was famous for losing wars, raising taxes, and generally making everyone miserable. But on a more personal level, he also enjoyed what we might call petty cruelty. Chroniclers accused him of starving prisoners to death, including his own nephew Arthur of Brittany, who inconveniently had a better claim to the throne. Was Arthur really starved in a dungeon or just quietly murdered some other way? Hard to say. But John's reputation was such that people believed it instantly. He was also rumored to have imprisoned a group of monks and left them to die because they refused to recognize his authority. Charming. It's not the flashy serial killer style of a Gilles de Rais or a Vlad the Impaler, but it's the same flavor, repetitive cruelty, aimed at people who couldn't fight back. So yes, while John wasn't stalking peasants in the woods, he definitely belongs in our medieval killers with power category. A man who managed to be both a terrible king and a part-time sadist, the knight called Robert le Maudit, the Accursed. Now let's slide over to France, where the chronicles give us some very colorful knights. One of them was Robert le Maudit, whose nickname literally means the Accursed, which is not a title you get for being the life of the party. Robert had a reputation for extreme violence during the 100 Years' War, unlike most knights who at least pretended to follow the chivalric code, Robert leaned fully into cruelty. Chronicles describe him burning villages, killing peasants for sport, and torturing captives. Was he technically a serial killer? Well, his body count was wrapped in the excuse of war. But his cruelty was personal and habitual enough that his enemies gave him a demonic nickname. That's usually a red flag. If people in the 14th century, an era not exactly known for its softness, are calling you accursed, you've probably gone above and beyond. Isabella of France. The she-wolf of France. Speaking of France and England, let's meet Isabella of France. She was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, married off to Edward II of England, and remembered forever by her not-so-friendly nickname, the she-wolf of France. Now, Isabella wasn't a serial killer in the bandit sense, but she certainly had a taste for political bloodshed. Edward II was not exactly a stellar husband. He preferred the company of his favorites, neglected his queen, and managed to alienate basically the entire nobility. Isabella, understandably annoyed, teamed up with her lover Roger Mortimer and led an invasion of England. Edward was deposed, imprisoned, and, according to many chroniclers, murdered in Berkeley Castle in 1327. The famous story says he was killed by having a red-hot poker inserted somewhere deeply unpleasant. Modern historians doubt this detail, but the fact that people believed it shows how Isabella's reputation leaned toward the sadistic. So, while she wasn't sneaking around with jars of pickled fetuses like Peter Niers, Isabella earned her place in the gallery of medieval cruelty. A noblewoman whose political revenge became so legendary that centuries later, Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe were still writing about it. Richard III, Murder in the Tower. Since we're already hanging around English royalty, let's gently glide toward Richard III, the much-maligned king whose reign was short, bloody, and immortalized by Shakespeare's hunchbacked villain. The most famous accusation against Richard is that he ordered the murder of his two young nephews, known as the Princes in the Tower. After their father Edward IV died, the boys were placed in the Tower of London. For safekeeping, they promptly disappeared. Conveniently, this cleared the path for Richard to claim the throne. Were they smothered? Starved? Poisoned? No one knows. Their fate remains one of history's great mysteries. But Richard's reputation as a ruthless usurper stuck. Even if he didn't personally kill them, he certainly didn't rush to clear up the situation. Does this make him a serial killer? Not exactly. But like John and Isabella, Richard sits in that medieval gray area where political power and personal cruelty overlap. Enough to keep him forever in the historical rogues gallery. Noble dungeons, a personal playground now. Let's talk dungeons. Because for a certain kind of medieval noble, a private dungeon wasn't just about security, it was entertainment. Many nobles kept captives far beyond the point of usefulness, experimenting with punishment as if it were a hobby. Chroniclers describe barons who delighted in inventing new tortures, hanging peasants upside down, boiling them in cauldrons, or chaining them to walls to starve slowly. One particularly nasty example was Geoffrey de Villeret, a French noble who allegedly used his prisoners as test subjects for different devices. Unfortunately, specifics are scarce. Either the records were lost, or scribes simply gave up documenting his experiments after a while. But the pattern is clear. Medieval nobility often blurred the line between justice and personal amusement. And while these dungeon lords don't always meet the modern FBI profile of a serial killer, their repeated, obsessive cruelty puts them in the same category. Just with a little more velvet and heraldry, let's pause here for a breath. We've drifted through England's cruel kings, France's cursed knights, and noble women with appetites for both power and revenge. We've peeked into dungeons, climbed the Tower of London, and sat uncomfortably close to rulers who thought torture was a perfectly fine way to spend a Wednesday. We've already spent some quality time with kings, queens, bandits, and the occasional cave-dwelling cannibal. But the Middle Ages also gave us a cast of killers who don't fit neatly into the royal tyrant or forest bandit mold. These are the eccentrics, assassins, priests, and nobles with strange compulsions that push them into darker territory. So, let's float gently into Italy, because nothing says eccentric like Renaissance politics, poisoned rings, and clergy who spent way too much time rethinking their vows. The Borgia family assassination as a family business, the Borgias. No medieval early modern murder tour would be complete without them. Technically, they were a Renaissance dynasty, but their style was medieval in spirit, elaborate plots, sudden disappearances, and a reputation for poison so strong that people swore they had their own family recipe, the patriarch. Pope Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia, had children, lovers, and about as much piety as a hungover raccoon. His son Cesare Borgia was a ruthless military commander who left behind a trail of corpses, both political and personal. Cesare wasn't shy about murdering rivals outright, but he also had a flair for subtlety. Stories claimed he carried a hollow ring filled with poison, perfect for a discreet handshake that turned deadly. Was that true? Maybe not, but the rumor alone shows how people viewed him. And then there was Lucretia Borgia, Cesar's sister. For centuries, she was painted as the femme fatale of the family, accused of poisoning lovers, rivals, and anyone who annoyed her. Modern historians think her reputation was exaggerated, likely the result of smear campaigns against the Borgias. But in the popular imagination, the Borgia name became synonymous with poisoning dinner guests for fun. Were they true serial killers? Maybe not in the clinical sense. But their brand of dynastic murder was so routine, so casual, that it blurs into the same territory. It wasn't a question of if someone would die, just who and how soon. The mad monk, case clerics who killed now. Let's wander into monasteries, those supposedly peaceful sanctuaries of prayer and study. Because as it turns out, not every monk was quietly illuminating manuscripts or brewing ale. Some were busier. One notorious example comes from Germany in the 1400s. A monk, known only from fragmentary records as Brother Rupert, was accused of murdering at least a dozen travelers who sought shelter at his monastery. He would offer food, a bed, and then quietly rob and kill them, burying the bodies in the cloister gardens. The details are fuzzy, as most medieval crime reports are, but the story circulated widely enough to suggest it had some truth. For the villagers, it was the ultimate betrayal. The very person entrusted with caring for souls was disposing of them, and he wasn't alone. Across Europe, several monks and priests were implicated in murders, usually tied to money, lust, or both. The point wasn't the scale, it was the shock. People trusted the church as the one safe place, and then found out their confessor might also be their executioner. Gilles de Rais, noble sadist light back in France. There's another curious figure, Gilles de Rais, a noble and soldier in the late 1500s. While not as flamboyantly cruel as Gilles de Rais, he had a reputation for punishing his servants and peasants with unnecessary violence. Stories say he forced serfs to perform humiliating tasks, beat them for entertainment, and sometimes staged mock trials where the sentence ended in death. In a society already used to casual brutality, for Rais to stand out as particularly cruel says a lot. He's one of those figures who never quite made it into the household name level of infamy. But the chronicles paint him as an aristocrat who essentially treated human suffering like a parlor game, which, not exactly a wholesome legacy. Noble compulsions, when murder becomes a routine one pattern, we see across these eccentric killers is compulsion. Unlike warlords like Vlad or bandits like Christman, these nobles and clerics weren't killing for strategy or survival. They did it habitually, repetitively, and often pointlessly. The monk who murdered travelers didn't need to. Monasteries were already wealthy from donations. The Borgias didn't need to eliminate every rival, yet somehow rivals kept ending up mysteriously dead. And nobles like Souvre didn't need to humiliate and kill peasants, but apparently it became their preferred form of leisure. Modern psychology would call this a pattern of compulsion, maybe even addiction. Medieval society just called it sin, and then usually justice if someone important finally got annoyed enough to do something about it. Assassins for hire. Italy's other industry. While we're in Italy, let's not forget another charming feature of medieval life, the professional assassin. In cities like Florence, Milan, and Venice, where politics was basically a contact sport, entire families hired killers the way we hire plumbers today. Some were specialists in poison. Others preferred knives. But what they shared was repetition, a track record of kills carried out with cold efficiency. These assassins never got the dramatic nicknames of werewolves or bluebeards, but they were a constant. Lurking part of urban life, for the rich, hiring a killer was just another tool of business. But for the assassins themselves, the job often became a lifelong career. And when murder becomes your trade, you're not so far off from the compulsive patterns of a serial killer, just better paid, and occasionally tipped in DCATS. And that feels like a good spot to pause tonight's drift. In this chapter, we've wandered through papal palaces with the Borgias, peeked into monasteries with murderous monks, and seeing nobles who turned cruelty into their weekend hobby. In Part 7, we'll keep floating toward the final stretch of our long night's tale. We'll meet some of the oddest cases of all, medieval women who took up serial killing, aristocrats whose paranoia led them into killing sprees, and one or two royals who blurred the line between eccentric ruler and outright psychopath. So far, we've lingered with kings, monks, mercenaries, and nobles who treated cruelty as if it were a family hobby. But one thing people often forget is that medieval women, despite living in a society that restricted their power, also show up in the historical record as repeat killers. Not always in the flashy battlefield sense, but in quieter, darker ways that left entire communities whispering, "Let's drift into their stories," and then float onward into the late medieval period, where paranoia itself seemed to push rulers into acts that look an awful lot like serial killing, the poison trials of Perugia in the Italian city of Perugia. During the late 1400s, several women were tried for what was basically a homegrown poisoning club. These weren't noblewomen or queens. They were more like everyday townsfolk who figured out that mixing herbs and toxins could solve a whole range of problems. Husbands who drank too much, rivals who annoyed them, wealthy neighbors whose property looked appealing. One woman, recorded under the name Giovanna La Rosa, was accused of killing at least 5 people with her healing remedies. She was described as a midwife and herbalist, professions already walking a thin line between respectability and suspicion. For some clients, she delivered babies. For others, she delivered something rather less lively. The records are fragmentary, of course. Trials at the time were as much about rumor as evidence. But the fact that multiple women were executed in Perugia for serial poisoning shows how widespread the fear was. To the city fathers, it looked less like isolated murders and more like an organized sisterhood of poisoners. Catherine de' Medici, the Black Widow queen. If we stay in Italy a little longer, we bump into Catherine de' Medici, who later became Queen of France. Catherine was surrounded by so much death in her lifetime that people still debate whether she was the cause or just an unlucky magnet for misfortune. She was rumored to have kept a cabinet of poisons, neatly bottled and labeled like a deadly spice rack. Supposedly, she tested them on prisoners to see how quickly they worked. Some stories even claim she had a pair of gloves laced with poison, ready for an elegant handshake of doom. Most historians will say these tales were exaggerated, invented by her enemies during the French Wars of Religion. Still, Catherine's reign did see mysterious deaths among rivals, and she was certainly comfortable with ordering massacres when it suited her politics. Whether or not she personally dabbled in poisons, her legend grew until she was remembered, less as a queen and more as a kind of Gothic anti-mother of France. Not a confirmed serial killer, but close enough in the way rumor and history merged into a single shadow. Elizabeth Báthory, the bloody Countess, and, of course, no twilight stroll through female killers would be complete without the infamous Elizabeth Báthory of Hungary. Technically, she lived in the very late medieval, early modern period, but her habits were so medieval in flavor that she deserves a mention. Báthory is remembered as the Blood Countess, accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young women on her estates. The most lurid legends claim she bathed in their blood to preserve her youth. More sober historians argue that the body count was probably lower and the blood-bathing detail was a smear. But there's no denying she was cruel. Witnesses describe beatings, burnings, and mutilations that were repeated so often they can only be described as compulsive. In her castle, Young peasant girls disappeared in numbers too large to ignore. Servants testified against her, and eventually she was walled up in her own chambers until she died. A grim fate for a woman who had turned cruelty into a daily routine, paranoia as a serial motive now. Let's step back and look at another common thread, paranoia. Because if inbreeding and unchecked power could break kings, paranoia finished the job. Take Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. He lived in the 16th century, technically outside the medieval bracket, but his methods fit right in. Ivan's paranoia led him to create the Oprychnina, a kind of personal death squad. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be rounded up, tortured, and killed, often in bizarrely theatrical ways. Whole towns were massacred because Ivan convinced himself they were plotting against him, while his killings were framed as political purges. The sheer repetition, the compulsive nature of it, reads less like strategy and more like a mind unraveling. In the end, Ivan was as much a prisoner of his paranoia as his victims were of his guards. He wasn't alone. Across Europe, paranoid rulers turned to repetitive murder sprees. Suspect a brother? Have him strangled. Doubt your wife's loyalty? Lock her up, or worse. Feel uneasy about the nobles? Order an execution or two, just in case it's not the clean. Modern definition of serial killing, but in practice, it was the same ritual, the same compulsion, the same trail of unnecessary corpses, madness in slow motion as we drift further toward the end of the medieval world. We see rulers who were remembered less for their conquests than for their unraveling. Charles VI of France, for example, suffered from bouts of psychosis that left him believing he was made of glass. During his lucid moments, he could still sign orders that led to executions. During his breaks, his attendants had to pad him in clothes so he wouldn't shatter. He wasn't a serial killer in the active sense. But he reminds us how thin the line could be between mental illness, paranoia, and cruelty. Once again, the medieval system allowed those in power to act out their compulsions with no restraint. And so, in this stretch, we've seen the other side of medieval killing, women with poisons, queens with reputations darker than reality, countesses who turned cruelty into routine, and kings whose paranoia did the killing for them. In Part 8, we'll move gently toward the last leg of our long, sleepy journey. We'll meet a handful of odd cases that don't fit anywhere else, traveling killers, nobles who died ironically by their own cruelty, and finally, we'll float into a soft conclusion about why the medieval world seemed to breed so many figures who blurred the line between ruler and killer. We're in the home stretch now. By this point, we've walked through castles, forests, monasteries, and dungeons, meeting kings with anger issues, monks with skeleton-filled gardens, and bandits who thought cannibalism was just another Tuesday. But before we finally dim the torchlight, let's wander through a few last stories, the stragglers. The killers who don't fit neatly into a category, the ironic fates, and the peculiar habits that close the circle of medieval cruelty, the traveling killer of Cologne 1. Last bandit worth mentioning comes from Germany in the early 1500s, a nameless figure described. In city records only as the traveler, he would drift from town to town, pretending to be a pilgrim, carrying a staff and a rosary. Once welcomed into homes or inns, he'd poison food or slit throats. Stealing what little his hosts had before moving on, he was caught not because of evidence, but because villagers noticed the pattern. Every time the pilgrim passed through, someone ended up dead. He confessed under torture to at least a dozen murders, though whether that number was true or just what the interrogators wanted to hear is anyone's guess. Either way, the idea of a killer hiding behind the image of a humble pilgrim says everything. About medieval trust and betrayal, the irony of Veselino da Romano now. Let's glide south into Italy for a story of poetic irony. Veselino III da Romano was a 13th century nobleman infamous for his cruelty. He earned the nickname the Son of the Devil, which again, in the Middle Ages meant you were really working overtime on being awful. Veselino delighted in massacres, especially of civilians in rebellious towns. Chroniclers say he once locked hundreds of prisoners in a wooden building and set it on fire, just to make a point. His cruelty was so excessive that even the Pope declared a crusade specifically against him. Imagine being so terrible that you, personally get crusaded, but here's the irony. When he was finally defeated and captured, he refused medical treatment for his wounds. He essentially killed himself slowly, rather than let others have the satisfaction. A cruel man, undone not by an enemy's sword, but by his own stubborn pride. The nobleman who fell into his own trap. Another tale, half history and half legend, tells of a French noble who built elaborate dungeons beneath his castle, filled with spikes, pits, and swinging blades. He supposedly used them for both justice and entertainment, forcing prisoners to run gauntlets that usually ended in death. The legend ends, of course, with the noble falling into one of his own traps. Was it true? Hard to say. Chroniclers loved stories where cruel men were destroyed by their own devices. But whether or not it literally happened, the tale spread because it felt right. The idea that cruelty has a way of circling back was too perfect for medieval storytellers to resist, the quiet serial killers not. Every medieval killer made it into the chronicles with flashy stories. Many were simply villagers who developed strange compulsions. Records from manorial courts show occasional women accused of killing multiple children in their care. Sometimes they were wet nurses who poisoned infants, perhaps out of resentment. Other times they were described as witches, though the accusations often boiled down to unexplained, deaths repeating around the same person. These quieter killers rarely got dramatic trials or legends. They slipped into the records as brief notes. So, executed for many murders, their names mostly lost, their lives reduced to a single chilling line. And perhaps that makes them the most haunting of all forgotten. Except for the bodies they left behind. The slow fade of medieval cruelty. By the late 1500s, Europe began shifting into the early modern period. Courts became more centralized, record-keeping improved, and states took more control over justice. That didn't end cruelty, far from it, but it meant individual nobles or monks had fewer chances to turn private dungeons into personal laboratories of pain. Serial killers didn't disappear, of course. They just adapted. Poisoners became more sophisticated. Highwaymen kept hunting travelers. Nobles still schemed and killed for power. But the world was changing, and the medieval era's uniquely chaotic mix of superstition, decentralization, and unchecked authority was fading. A gentle closing thought so. After all this drifting through impalements, poison rings, bloody dungeons, and compulsive cruelties, what's left? The medieval world gave us killers who were remembered not just for their body counts, but for how strangely personal their violence was. Bandits who decorated caves with bones. Nobles who tortured for amusement. Kings who murdered nephews out of paranoia. Queens who turned rumor into Gothic legend. It wasn't efficiency. It wasn't strategy. It was compulsion, cruelty, and often a total absence of restraint, and that's why these figures still linger. Not because they were the only killers of their age, but because their habits, their routines, their obsessions echo the patterns we still recognize today. So, as you drift now into sleep, let the torches fade. The dungeons close. The bandits return to their forests. And the kings, queens, and countesses, cruel, paranoid, or just plain strange, sink back into their castles of stone. The Middle Ages are gone. But the stories of their killers remain quietly, waiting to be whispered again. Good night.